Imagine a winter night in the Arctic Circle, where the wind howls like a living thing across frozen plateaus, temperatures plummet to -40, and the polar darkness swallows everything beyond the beam of your flashlight. Visibility drops to zero in whiteout conditions, and every step on the ice could be your last. This is northern Norway in 1986, during the height of the Cold War. Norway has always been NATO's northern flank, a thin line of defense separating the free world from the massive Soviet military buildup on the Kola Peninsula, just across the border. The Kola housed more nuclear submarines than anywhere else on Earth, along with bomber bases and mechanized divisions ready to pour westward. NATO's strategy relied heavily on reinforcing Norway quickly in the event of war. Large-scale exercises like Teamwork and Anchor Express practiced amphibious landings and rapid deployment of Allied forces, including U.S. Marines pre-positioned with equipment in caves across the country. But reconnaissance was the eyes and ears of that defense. Small teams of elite soldiers, often multinational NATO patrols, would ski deep into the mountainous border regions to monitor potential invasion routes, scout Soviet activity, and establish observation posts. These missions were grueling, dangerous work, navigating glaciers, avoiding avalanches, and operating in isolation for days or weeks. In the winter of 1986, one such mission went horribly wrong. A joint NATO reconnaissance team, consisting of Norwegian Rangers, British Royal Marines, and American soldiers, departed from a remote forward operating base near the Porsanger garrison in Finnmark County. Their objective: a high-altitude glacier plateau suspected as a possible Soviet infiltration route. They were never seen again. Officially, it was chalked up to extreme weather, an unexpected blizzard that buried their tracks and claimed their lives. But the survivors from the support team, and those who later searched the area, tell a different story. Whispers of strange lights on the ice, unexplained radio interference, and something watching from the abandoned barracks they used as a staging point. Tonight, we're going to hear directly from one of the men who was there, a former U.S. Army sergeant attached to the mission. His account, along with declassified details and interviews with Norwegian officers, paints a picture far more unsettling than any official report. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Forgotten Barracks. My name is Sergeant Michael Harlan, U.S. Army, attached to the 10th Mountain Division, but on temporary duty with NATO's Allied Forces North in early 1986. I had done cold weather training in Alaska, but nothing prepared me for the Arctic Circle in winter. The darkness up there is absolute. The cold so sharp it feels like it's cutting through your bones. We flew into Laxelv Airfield on a C-130, then transferred to a pair of Sea King helicopters that dropped us off near the Porsanger garrison in Finnmark County. The main garrison was our official jump-off point, but command had other plans. They wanted us forward, closer to the border zone. So they sent our 12-man joint recon team, 4 Norwegian Rangers, 3 British Royal Marines, and 5 Americans, to an old auxiliary barracks known as Glacier Outpost. The Norwegians called it the Shadow Barracks, built in the early 1950s as overflow for large-scale exercises. The structure was half buried into the hillside for protection against airstrikes. Concrete bunkers lined with wooden interiors, long abandoned and mothballed since the 1970s. When our ski-doo snowmobiles pulled up in the dim twilight of late January, the place looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Snow had drifted high against the steel doors. Icicles hung from the eaves like rows of frozen spears. The wind cut across the open plateau, carrying the faint smell of pine and diesel. Captain Lars Olsen, our Norwegian team leader, a hard-faced ranger with years on the border, gathered us outside before we went in. "Listen up," he said, breath freezing in the air. "This site hasn't been used in over a decade. Power is off, but we have 2 generators. Heaters work, but conserve fuel. No external lights after dark. OPSEC. We are 20 kilometers from the border. Soviet patrols have been pushing closer. We stay sharp. We were 12 strong. Olsen and his 3 Norwegian scouts, all veterans of the border guard. Sergeant Davis and 2 Royal Marines from 42 Commando, hauling the heavy HF radio. And my 5 Americans, including myself and 4 younger soldiers fresh from Fort Drum. We carried standard Arctic kit, white over whites, M16A1s with cold weather modifications, AN/PRC 77 radios, and enough MREs and freeze-dried rations for 2 weeks. Each man had a sleeping bag rated to -40, plus extra layers and crampons. Inside, The barracks smelled of damp wood, old oil, and something metallic, like blood long dried. Long hallways stretched in both directions, lined with bunk rooms and storage lockers. Dust lay thick on the floorboards. We moved in, kicking snow off our boots, and set up in the main dormitory. Generators kicked on with a low rumble. Stoves were lit, and the temperature slowly climbed from sub-zero to bearable. That first night we sat around the mess hall, sharing coffee and stories. The Brits complained about the cold. The Norwegians laughed that we hadn't seen real winter yet. Someone passed around a tin of snuff. It was almost normal. Around midnight, most of us were asleep. I was on first watch, sitting near the stove with my rifle across my lap. That's when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking in heavy boots. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, paused outside our door, then moved on. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the corridor. Empty. Just the faint creak of settling wood and the distant howl of wind outside. I told myself it was the building contracting in the cold, or snow shifting on the roof. But when I got back to my bunk, Private Jenkins, one of the younger Americans, was sitting up, wide awake. "Sarge," he whispered, "you hear that? Someone pacing outside our door." I told him it was nothing, just the wind. He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe me. The next morning we prepped for the glacier push. We cleaned weapons, checked batteries, and loaded sleds. As we worked, Private Eriksson, one of the Norwegian scouts, mentioned something that stuck with me. "My father trained here in the 60s, he said quietly. He said the barracks had a reputation. Men hearing voices in empty rooms. Shadows moving when no one was there. They called it the mountain's memory. The rest of us laughed it off. We were soldiers, not ghost hunters. We had a mission. Ski reconnaissance along a high plateau overlooking suspected Soviet infiltration routes. The glacier was waiting. But as we stepped outside into the gray half-light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us leave. The barracks sat silent behind us, half buried in snow, its windows dark. And somewhere in those empty hallways, I swear the footsteps started again. Chapter 2. The push to the glacier. The mission objective was clear. Conduct a ski reconnaissance along a high-altitude glacier plateau that intelligence flagged as a potential Soviet infiltration corridor. Reports from the border guard indicated increased activity on the Kola side, more vehicle tracks, helicopter overflights, and probing patrols testing NATO response times. Our job was to establish observation posts, log any movement, and confirm or deny the route's viability for mechanized forces. We departed the Shadow Barracks at first light, which in late January meant a faint gray glow on the horizon around 10 in the morning. Captain Olsen led the column, his Norwegian scouts breaking trail. The 3 Royal Marines followed, Sergeant Davis and his men pulling the Akio sled loaded with the heavy AN/PRC 77 radio set and extra batteries. My Americans brought up the rear, hauling ammunition, medical kit, and the whiteout tent. We moved in single file, roped together for crevasse safety, skis hissing over the hard-packed snow. The terrain climbed steadily from the barracks plateau into the mountains. Wind scoured the ridges, whipping spindrift into our faces and cutting visibility to 50 meters on a good day. Temperatures sat at -35 Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin frosted in minutes. Every breath burned the lungs. We wore balaclavas, goggles, and multiple layers. But the chill still found ways in, at the wrists, around the neck, through boot seams. "Maintain interval," Olsen called back over the wind. "Stay in the track or you'll post hole and exhaust yourself." Conversation was sparse. We saved breath for movement. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of skis, the creak of bindings, and the constant moan of the gale. Sergeant Davis broke the silence once on the squad net. "Christ, lads, if Ivan tries crossing this ground in winter, he'll freeze solid before he reaches the first ridge." A few muffled laughs crackled over the radio. Gallows humor, the kind that keeps you sane when you're 20 kilometers from help and the nearest enemy is just over the next frozen valley. By mid-afternoon, we reached the glacier proper. The ice field stretched white and endless, broken by pressure ridges and hidden crevasses. We halted to rope up fully, each man tied to the next with 30-meter intervals. Norwegian scouts probed ahead with avalanche poles, testing for weak snow bridges. One wrong step, and you drop into a blue abyss hundreds of feet deep. We pushed on until we crested the target ridgeline. The view east opened briefly through a gap in the clouds. Distant peaks on the Soviet side, dark against the pale sky. Somewhere beyond lay the garrisons of Pechenga and the submarine pens of the Northern Fleet. We dug in fast, snow caves for shelter, the radio antenna rigged on collapsible masts. At the scheduled 1800 check-in with Porsinger Garrison, we hit the first real problem. Olsen keyed the mic. Control, this is Glacier Shadow. Position established. No movement observed. How copy? Static. Then more static, thick and rolling like surf. He repeated the call. Nothing but interference. Davis took over, fine-tuning the set. Could be auroral propagation. Solar activity's been high. We tried again at 2000 hours. Same result. The signal strength meter barely twitched, yet the batteries read full and the equipment had passed pre-mission checks. Private Erickson looked uneasy as he scanned the horizon. This plateau, he said quietly. My father's unit lost comms here in '68. They blamed the mountain, said it swallows signals, or repeats old ones. We dismissed it as superstition. Soldiers can't afford to believe in ghosts when the real enemy is close enough to touch. That night we rotated watches in pairs. I drew second shift with Corporal Hayes, the youngest Royal Marine. We sat in the cave entrance, rifles ready, staring into blackness so complete it felt solid. Around 0200 the clouds parted briefly, revealing a sky thick with stars. Then I saw them lights. Low on the horizon, blue-green orbs that moved in slow, deliberate patterns. Not the dancing curtains of the aurora borealis. These were steady, almost mechanical. Hayes, I whispered. You seeing this? He lifted his binoculars. Yeah, too low for aurora. Too organized for aircraft. No rotor wash. No navigation strobes. We logged it in the journal. Possible Soviet signaling or experimental flares. Reported it when comms finally punched through hours later during a brief window. Back in the cave, Jenkins complained of a pounding headache and fragmented dreams. Whispers calling his name from under the ice. We chalked it up to altitude and exhaustion, gave him aspirin, and told him to sleep it off. As we packed to displace to the secondary observation point at dawn, I glanced back toward the shadow barracks far below. The building was invisible in the distance, buried in snow and shadow. But I swear, for just a moment, I saw a single light flicker in one of its windows. We were miles away. No power running. No one left behind. And something in me knew that whatever had started pacing those hallways the first night had not stayed behind. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Ice. After 3 days on the Glacier Plateau, we skied back down to the Shadow Barracks for resupply and a short refit before the planned longer loop deeper into the border zone. The descent was faster than the climb, but no less punishing. Knees aching from the steep drops, faces raw from windburn. We arrived in the late afternoon gloom, the barracks emerging from the snow like a half-buried relic. The moment we pulled up on our snowmobiles, something felt off. The front door we had secured with a padlock hung slightly ajar. Snow had blown in, forming a small drift across the threshold. Fresh tracks led into the building, booted prints, human-sized, but already half-filled by drifting powder, as if they had been made hours earlier. Captain Olsen raised a fist, signaling halt. We dismounted, weapons up, and cleared the entrance in pairs. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The generators were still running. We had left one on low to keep the pipes from freezing, but the heaters had been turned down or tampered with. The hallway lights flickered weakly. Olsen examined the tracks under flashlight. Reindeer, maybe, he muttered, or a local herder checking the site. But the prints were too regular, too straight. No animal hooves, no wandering pattern. They went directly down the main corridor, paused at the dormitory door, then returned the same way. We secured the building again, higher this time, and began unloading sleds. Rations, fuel, fresh batteries. Routine work to shake off the unease. At night the disturbances began in earnest. We gathered in the mess hall around the stoves, thawing frozen boots and brewing coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. The conversation started light. Davis recounting a training mishap in Scotland. Erickson sharing stories of Sami reindeer herders who navigated these mountains better than any GPS. But as the hours wore on and the wind picked up outside, the mood shifted. Private Jenkins was the first to mention it. He had been quieter since the glacier, pale even under the windburn. I keep hearing things, he said finally, staring into his mug. Whispers. like voices just under the ice when we were up there, calling names. We told him it was wind through the crevasses, or fatigue playing tricks, but his eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Then the radios started acting up again. Even inside the barracks, with the big base station set hooked to the external antenna, we picked up fragments on idle frequencies. Old call signs, NATO phonetic from the 1950s and 60s. Voices speaking Norwegian in clipped, formal tones, as if reading from a long archive log. Erickson leaned closer to the speaker, face tightening. "That's my father's unit," he said. I recognized the cadence. Exercise Winter Shield, 1964. They used this exact building. Static swallowed the transmission before anyone could respond. Later, when most of the team had turned in, Corporal Hayes woke me for watch relief. He looked shaken. "Sarge," he whispered in the dim red light of the dormitory. I saw something. Down in the lower bunker level. Tall figure in the doorway of the old comms room. Wearing an old greatcoat. Looked like WWII German issue. Turned and walked away when I called out. Gone when I followed. I went with him to check. The lower corridor was colder, breath visible even inside. Frost feathered the concrete walls. We cleared room by room, storage lockers, generator room, the dusty comms shack with its ancient tube radios. Nothing. No footprints in the dust. But the air felt heavy, like the mountain itself was pressing down. Back upstairs, Jenkins was sitting up again, rocking slightly. "They're in the walls," he muttered. "Talking about us. Saying we shouldn't have come back." Olsen overheard and pulled us all into the mess hall for a quiet talk. "This site has history," he admitted. "Built on top of a German coastal battery from the occupation. When they retreated in '44, they burned everything, scorched earth. Some bodies never recovered. Avalanches took others over the years. Norwegian units have reported incidents, hearing things, seeing movement. We always blamed imagination. Cold. Isolation. No one laughed this time. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the steel doors. Snow hissed against the windows. And then, clear as day on our primary frequency, a scream, distorted, terrified. "They're here. In the walls. Get them out." The voice sounded like Jenkins, but he was sitting right in front of us, mouth open in shock. We checked the transmitter log. Nothing sent. No power spike. Olsen made the call. "Abort the deep recon loop. Hold position at the barracks and request early extraction." A major storm was already building on the forecasts. Whiteout conditions inbound. By morning, the blizzard hit full force. Visibility 0. Winds gusting to 60 knots. No helo could reach us for days. We were sealed in with whatever had woken up in the shadow barracks. And the whispers were no longer coming from the radios. They were coming from inside the rooms themselves. Chapter 4. The Night Watch. The blizzard slammed into the shadow barracks like an artillery barrage. Winds howled at 60 knots, rattling the steel doors and driving snow through every crack. Visibility outside was absolute 0, whiteout conditions that turned the world into a roaring void. No helicopter could reach us for days, maybe a week. We were cut off, sealed inside with dwindling fuel, limited rations, and whatever else shared the building. Captain Olsen ordered us to consolidate in the main mess hall. We dragged mattresses from the dormitory, barricaded the side corridors with lockers and tables, and kept both generators running to feed the stoves. Rifles stayed loaded, magazines seated, chambers empty but ready. We posted double watches at the 2 entrances and rotated every 2 hours. Around the flickering light of the kerosene lamps, the stories came out, soldiers talking in low voices to keep the darkness at bay. Erickson went first. He spoke of a 1972 winter exercise in the same training area. A Norwegian platoon vanished during a night march on the glacier. Search parties found them 3 weeks later, frozen in a crevasse, faces contorted in absolute terror. Official cause was exposure and hypoxia, but the survivors who heard their last radio traffic swore the missing men screamed about shadows moving against the wind, tall figures that paced alongside them on the ice. Sergeant Davis followed with a story from the Arctic convoys of World War II. Royal Navy sailors on Murmansk runs reported hearing drowned comrades calling from beneath the hull, voices carried through the frozen sea. Some claimed to see pale hands pressing against portals from the outside. Even Olsen, normally stone-faced, opened up. "My grandfather was in the resistance here during the occupation," he said quietly. "He helped chase the Germans north in '44, '45. When they retreated, they torched everything, villages, depots, even their own dead. But some units disappeared in these mountains. Avalanches, he said. Or worse. He told me the land remembers. The cold keeps things that should have passed on. No one mocked the tales. Not after what we had already experienced. Midnight came and went. The temperature inside dropped despite the stoves. Breath hung in clouds. Then the lights began to flicker, generator output steady, fuel levels fine. But the bulbs dimmed and surged as if something was drawing power. Shadows on the walls stretched longer than they should, twisting into shapes that didn't match our own. At 0230, the knocking started. It came from below, slow, deliberate raps against the floorboards of the lower bunker level. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Like a signal, Olsen organized a sweep. 6 of us, rifles up, flashlights cutting beams through the dust. We descended the concrete stairs. The air grew colder with every step, frost forming on our eyelashes. The knocking stopped the moment we reached the bottom corridor. We cleared room by room. Storage lockers, empty. Generator room, humming normally. Old armory, racks bare. Then the calm shack. The door was open. Inside, the ancient tube radios glowed faintly, dials turning on their own. Frost etched the concrete walls in jagged patterns that looked almost like letters. Erickson shone his light closer. G-board. He read aloud, voice flat. Norwegian for GOA. The words hadn't been there before. We backed out fast, secured the stairwell door with a chain and padlock. Back upstairs, Jenkins was unraveling. He sat in the corner, knees drawn up, rocking. They know our names, he whispered. They're listing them, one by one. We tried to calm him, hot coffee, a blanket, watch him close. But at 0345 he snapped, eyes wild. He bolted for the main door, screaming about voices telling him to come outside. Jenkins, stand down, Olsen ordered. Too late. He threw the bar aside and vanished into the storm. We went after him, roped together, headlamps cutting futile beams into the swirling snow. His tracks filled almost instantly, but we followed for 20 minutes, shouting until our throats bled. Nothing. The blizzard swallowed him whole. We retreated, half frozen, and barricaded again. At dawn the wind eased slightly, enough for a radio window. Olsen transmitted an emergency extraction request, reporting 1 man missing, presumed lost to exposure. As we waited in silence, the lights appeared again, outside the windows this time. Those same blue-green orbs from the glacier, drifting closer through the dying storm, circling the barracks like predators. We watched them from behind frosted glass, rifles trained, but fingers off triggers. Were they signals, natural phenomena, or something drawn to the building, feeding on our fear? By the time the storm broke enough for rescue, we were running on fumes, fuel, sleep, and sanity. But the knocking never resumed. Chapter 5. Vanished on the ice. The storm finally broke 2 days after Jenkins disappeared. The wind dropped to a steady moan, and ragged holes opened in the cloud cover, letting weak polar light filter across the snow. We had been running on minimal sleep, rotating watches, nursing the generators with the last of the diesel. Faces were gaunt, eyes red from stove smoke and strain. No one spoke of what we had seen or heard anymore. We just waited for the radio to bring word of rescue. At 1,100 hours the call came through, faint but clear. A Norwegian Sea King from Bannock Airfield was inbound, weather window narrow. Estimated arrival 30 minutes. We packed fast. Weapons, remaining rations, logbooks, anything personal left behind. The barracks would be abandoned again, perhaps for good this time. As we filed out into the blinding white, the building looked smaller somehow, hunkered against the hillside like it was trying to sink back into the mountain. Snow had erased all external tracks, ours, Jenkins, anything that might have circled the night before. Only the faint glow of those drifting lights lingered in memory. The helo touched down on the frozen plateau 500 meters away, rotors whipping fresh powder into spirals. We loaded in silence. 11 men where 12 had started. Captain Olsen gave the pilot a terse sit rep. 1 missing, presumed exposure. The crew chief nodded without questions. They had seen it before in these mountains. As we lifted off, I looked down one last time. The shadow barracks receded, windows dark, doors hanging open to the wind. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the lower bunker doorway. A tall figure in a long coat, watching us leave. Then the snow closed over everything. Back at Porsangmon Garrison, the debrief was swift and clinical. Medical checks for frostbite and hypothermia. Psych eval, standard after extended isolation. We were told to write statements, then warned. The anomalies, lights, voices, interference were classified, attributed to extreme environmental factors. Possible Soviet electronic countermeasures. Jenkins listed as missing, presumed dead. Case closed pending recovery of remains. The team fragmented quickly. The British Marines rotated south to Scotland within days. The Norwegians reassigned to other border units. My Americans and I flew out on the next MSC flight to Ramstein, then home. Handshakes were brief. No one lingered. Search parties went out once the weather stabilized fully. Ground teams with dogs, helicopters with Fleur. They found Jenkins' pack and rifle on the Glacier Plateau, neatly placed against a pressure ridge as if he had simply set them down to rest. Snow around them undisturbed. No struggle marks. No blood. No body trail leading away. The search grid expanded for weeks. Nothing more was ever recovered. Command settled on crevasse fall or avalanche burial. Clean. Explainable. Families notified accordingly. But we knew different. Years later, portions of the mission file were declassified under Norwegian Freedom of Information laws. Buried in appendices. Multiple prior incidents in the Halkavar training area dating back to the 1950s. Patrols reporting unexplained lights on the ice. Radio traffic from long-canceled call signs. Teams experiencing mass auditory hallucinations, whispers, footsteps knocking. One 1967 report mentioned frost writing on bunker walls identical to what we saw. G-board. All attributed to hypoxia. Carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heaters. Or psychological stress. Yet the pattern persisted across decades. Different units, different nationalities. The Shadow barracks were demolished in 1992 during a base consolidation. Explosives took the main structure. Bulldozers pushed the rubble into a ravine. Officially for safety reasons, structural decay. Unofficially, Norwegian officers I spoke with off-record said no one wanted to use it again. To this day, Sami reindeer herders avoid the site. They speak of Vardi, guardian spirits of the mountain, angry at the wars fought across their land. German soldiers, Norwegian resistance fighters, Cold War patrols, all claimed by the ice when they lingered too long. Jenkins' name is on a memorial plaque at Fort Drum, listed among training accidents. His family still hopes. Every spring melt, someone thinks they spot something on the glacier, but it's always just snow and shadow. I left the Army in 1989, never went back to the Arctic. But some nights, when the temperature drops hard and the wind rattles the windows, I hear it again. Slow footsteps in an empty hallway. A voice whispering names from under the ice. And I wonder if the mountain ever truly let us go, or if it's still waiting for the next team to disturb its long, frozen watch. Chapter 6. The Search and Silence. After the extraction, the Norwegian armed forces launched an extensive search operation across the glacier and the surrounding ridges. It was one of the largest efforts in the Halkavar area since the post-war years. Ground teams from the garrison infantry and Home Guard skied grids with avalanche probes and cadaver dogs. Sea Kings and Bell helicopters flew low-level patterns equipped with forward-looking infrared, scanning for heat signatures or anomalies in the snow. Even a P-3 Orion from Andir ran overflights with magnetic anomaly detectors, the kind normally used for submarine hunting. They found almost nothing. Jenkins' rucksack and M16 were located 3 days into the search, propped neatly against a wind-scoured ice ridge near our secondary observation point. The weapon was clean, safety on, magazine still inserted. The pack was closed, contents undisturbed, no food missing, sleeping bag still rolled tight. Snow around the site was wind-packed and smooth. No collapse indicating a crevasse fall. No disturbance suggesting struggle or avalanche debris. It looked as if he had simply stopped, set his gear down, and walked away. Tracks led away from the site for perhaps 50 meters. Faint boot prints in soft snow, then ended abruptly. Not tapered off, not buried. Ended. As though the mountain had lifted him straight up. The dogs refused to follow the trail. They circled, whined, and sat down, ears flat. Searches expanded the grid for another week. Nothing more turned up. No clothing fragments, no blood, no body. The official conclusion, signed off by both Norwegian and NATO command. Private Jenkins succumbed to acute hypothermia complicated by disorientation. wandered until collapse, and was subsequently buried by drifting snow or claimed by an undetected crevasse. Case closed. Remains unrecovered. The 11 of us who made it back were scattered fast. The Royal Marines flew south within 48 hours. The Norwegian scouts were reassigned to quieter sectors along the border. My remaining Americans and I were on a C-141 out of Bannock 2 days later, routed through Ramstein and back to the States. There were no farewell drinks, no shared debrief over coffee, just quiet nods and averted eyes. I rotated out of the 10th Mountain in 1988 and left the Army entirely the following year. I never returned to cold weather operations. Never wanted to see another whiteout as long as I lived. Years passed before I tried to reach the others. I found Erickson in 1999, retired and living near Troms. We spoke on the phone once. His voice was steady, but careful. The barracks were built on a bad place, he told me. Old Sami ground. Before the Germans, before us. My father warned me. The mountain doesn't like steel and concrete driven into its side. It keeps what it takes. He wouldn't say more. Just that he never went back to that part of Finnmark again. Sergeant Davis answered a letter I sent in 2003. Short note. He had left the Corps, worked security in London, mentioned bad dreams about blue lights on snow, asked me not to write again. Olson I never located. Personnel records showed him promoted to major, then nothing. Retired early, perhaps, or transferred somewhere the files don't show. The Shadow barracks themselves were raised in the summer of 1992. Engineers used shaped charges to drop the main structure, then bulldozed the debris into a ravine and covered it with rock. Official reason: structural instability after decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Unofficially, a Norwegian lieutenant I met at a NATO reunion in 2010 told me the order came from high up. No one wanted another unit billeted there. Even now, large exercises like cold response route around that specific plateau. Maps mark it as restricted, avalanche hazard they say. But avalanche warnings don't explain the satellite anomalies that occasionally pop up in open-source imagery. Brief, unexplained light sources on clear polar nights, right over the old site. Analysts blame lens flares or atmospheric refraction. Locals know better. Jenkins' name sits on the training casualty memorial at Fort Drum. His mother still calls the post every spring, asking if the melt turned anything up. It never has. I don't talk about Operation Glacier Shadow much. When I do, people nod politely, assume cold weather delirium or too many war movies. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the temperature drops hard outside, I hear them again, slow, measured footsteps in an empty corridor. A faint voice carried on static, listing names, and I know the mountain is still keeping its watch. Chapter 7. Echoes from the glacier. Decades have passed since Operation Glacier Shadow. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the border that once bristled with tanks and submarines grew quiet. NATO and Russia even ran joint exercises for a while. New threats emerged elsewhere: deserts, cities, cyberspace. The Arctic seemed forgotten, just another frozen frontier gathering dust in the archives. But the ice doesn't forget. In recent years, the region has heated up again, literally and figuratively. Melting permafrost, opening sea lanes, untapped resources. Russia rebuilt its northern bases, deployed new hypersonic units along the Kola. NATO responded with larger exercises. Cold Response, Arctic Challenge, Trident Juncture. Thousands of troops now train where our small team once skied alone. Yet some areas remain quietly off limits. The old Shadow Barracks site is marked on modern maps as a permanent avalanche hazard zone. No units bivouac there. Routes swing wide around the plateau we patrolled. Pilots report instrument glitches when overflying it. Compasses lagging. GPS dropping for seconds at a time. Satellite imagery, publicly available now, occasionally captures anomalies. Brief thermal blooms on clear polar nights, or unexplained light sources that don't match known settlements or vehicles. Analysts file them under atmospheric phenomena or sensor artifacts. Veterans who served in Finnmark look closer and say nothing. I followed the stories quietly over the years. Veteran forums, Norwegian defense blogs, restricted Facebook groups for old border guards. Whispers persist. A 2008 patrol during cold response reported hearing footsteps pacing their tent at night. Inside the fabric, not out. Another team in 2015 found frost words on their snowcat windshield after a whiteout. The same two words we saw on Gboard. No official reports filed, just quiet warnings passed down to the next rotation. Locals in Laxelv and older Sami herders still speak of the glacier's guardians. Not ghosts in the Western sense, but something older. Spirits tied to the land since before nations drew lines across it. Soldiers from every army that marched through, German, Russian, Allied, Norwegian, left pieces behind when the mountain claimed them. The cold preserves them. The long nights give them voice. Was what we experienced truly supernatural? Mass psychosis brought on by isolation, hypoxia, and carbon monoxide from faulty stoves. A classified Soviet psychological operation using infrasound or holographic projectors to deter NATO reconnaissance. There are theories for every taste, but none explain Jenkins walking away from his perfectly placed gear. None account for the voices knowing our names before we spoke them aloud. None justify why, 39 years later, I still wake at 0300 hearing measured footsteps in an empty house. The missing remain missing. No closure for families. No final coordinates to mark on a map. I never went back to Norway. Never felt the need to confront the mountain again. Some doors, once opened, are better left sealed. Yet every winter solstice, when the polar night swallows Finnmark whole, I think of those 11 men who flew out, and the one who stayed behind. I think of the tall figure in the doorway, coat heavy with rime, watching the helo lift away. The glacier keeps its watch, and somewhere under the ice, Private Jenkins is still walking.